Hello, my name is Rob Reynolds. Welcome to Mat-073. Today we get our last section of Chapter 5, and we're going to be discussing variation functions. And there's basically two types of variation function. There's a direct variation function where y is varying directly with x, and then we have some constant. And then there's an inverse variation where y is equal to the inverse of multiplying by x is dividing by x. So we're going to learn these two equations today. And then look at some application story problems. So our first example is kind of just reading through and seeing what's happening if in 1 hour you earn $17, in 2 hours you earn $34, and so on and so forth. Looks like there's a direct variation that you keep getting $17 every hour. So you could write down the earnings is equal to $17 times each hour that you work, and we'll let each hour be t. And so that's a direct variation function. What I want to point out to you is be careful, because on these direct variation functions, although there's a product that's going on here, your earnings is equal to 17 times the number of hours that you work, there's also a quotient in here. Your earnings divided by your time should always equal 17. So if you were to take 17 and divide by 1, you get 17. 34 divided by 2, 51 divided by 3 is 17, and 68 divided by 4 is also 17. So a direct variation, although a direct variation means y equals kx, that means that there's constantly a quotient. Every y divided by x will be equal to some constant, and why they let k be a constant I'm not quite sure instead of c, but in math oftentimes we let the constant be k. But be careful, direct variation means multiplication, but look at the constant, it's always a quotient, and that's sometimes confusing to students. So y equals kx, direct variation function, but the constant is always a proportion, so k is constantly a quotient. So let's look at our first example. Be careful, sometimes they say find the variation constant, sometimes they say find like a letter. They could say find k, they could say find x or y, or they could say find an equation. So we have to read the directions very carefully, because depending on what they're asking, that's how we're going to answer the question. So this says it varies directly. So y varies directly with x. So I'm going to write down y varies directly with x. That's a direct variation function. That's a product. And it says y is 15 and x is 3, and it says solve for k. Easy enough, I'll divide by 3, and k is equal to 5. So answering the question, k equals 5. Direct variation functions mean that the y-intercept is always a 0. So that you may recognize this form, y equals mx plus b. Well, be careful. If it's a direct variation function, the y-intercept has to go through the origin. Let's try another. This one says it varies directly again, but instead of y equals kx, I've got b varies directly with t, time. So I'm going to write that down. B varies directly with t. Then I'm going to, oh, by the way, what are we trying to find? This time we're not trying to find the constant. It says how many. And I can only imagine that means how many bolts. So we're going to be solving for a letter this time. We're going to be solving for bolts, given that there's 5 hours. So there's actually two parts to this. Part A would be find the equation, and then part B would be use that equation to find an answer. So the more steps that you show on this, the better it will be. So we're going to ignore this second 5-hour thing. I'm going to reserve that for part B, but part A, I think I have enough information. I'm going to be plugging in this 3,000 is the number of bolts, 3,288, and then the 2 is how long it takes. So the first part, for part A, says let's just solve for k. by plugging in the number of bolts and the time. So K turns out to be 1644. So I'm going to, part A says, let's just write the equation. The number of bolts now is 1644 times time. Now part B says, let's find the number of bolts, how many bolts in 5 hours. So part B would be, well, let's let the time be 5, and then find part B and answer the question. There's 8,220 bolts. So it's kind of a two-step process. The first thing we want to do is just write an equation. And then the second part of this is use this equation to answer the question by plugging in the 5. And then, of course, we could always state the final solution. Let's go again. Find the equation that varies directly. So here it comes. It says y varies directly, which means I'm going to do kx, but be careful. This says the square of x. So instead of just y equals kx, I have to square that x value. And again, this one just says find the equation. So we're not looking for k. We're not looking for a y or an x. We're just looking for actually step A is what I called it before. We don't have to do step B. So once you find the equation for step A, we're done. So let's plug in 36 is equal to k times 3 squared. Divide through by 9 and get 4. But we're not done. This is not the equation. The equation is y equals 4x squared, answering the question. So you may think that you're done solving for k, but the question didn't ask for k. The question said find the equation. So I would stop with y equals 4x squared. So after direct variation, we might want to look at inverse variation. And inverse doesn't say y equals kx, it says y equals k divided by x, but be careful, inverse variation, the inverse of multiplication is division, also has some concept of k being a product. It's constantly x times y or y times x. So check it out. 1 times 8 is 8. 2 times 4 is 8. If you multiply 8/3 times 3, you get 8. So see, it's their product is constantly the same number. But we call this an inverse variation because y is equal to, if you solve for y, it's a quotient. So be careful, it's kind of this same, it's the opposite of what we were doing before, and that's what inverse means. So for inverse variation, since we have this constant product going on, then we say the time that it takes is 8 divided by the number of people. So it's the more people, so if you have one person, it takes 8 hours. If you have 2 people, it's 4 hours. So as you increase the number of people, notice that the y value is decreasing. So that's that inverse, because if it's a direct variation function, it would be increasing. So the opposite of increase is decrease. So the inverse would be, function would be y equals k divided by x, getting smaller. So let's find an example. It says y varies inversely with x. So I'll write down y is equal to k divided by x, and it says to what? Find the equation. So let's just plug in 30 is equal to k divided by x is 20, and I get 600 equals k, but it didn't say find k. It says write the equation. So I would say y is equal to 600 divided by x for a final solution. And remember, inverse variation function is not linear like what we were looking at before. For direct variation function, inverse is going to be a decreasing function. And so y equals 600 divided by x. So be careful. If it says y varies directly, then it's multiplying, but it says the nth power. So y varies directly with the third power of n, or the third, we could let that be x, the third power of x. And then this is varies inversely. So y varies inversely with the third power of x. Now what I haven't talked about is the last one called varies jointly. And jointly just means I've got several different variables going on. Maybe y varies jointly with x and z. So we're going to start looking at maybe at some varies jointly examples, which means it could have direct and inverse all in the same problem. So let's see. It doesn't say y varies. It says a varies. So I'll say a equals, I've got some constant b and c. And it said, it doesn't mention inverse, so it varies directly or jointly, directly with b and c. So multiply. So let's see if we can plug in. Oh, by the way, it says find an equation, so we're not going to solve for a variable. So 48 is equal to k times 4 times, oops, that's a 4, times 2, divide through by 8, and I get 6. But remember, that's not the answer because it said write the equation. So I'll have to say a is equal to 6bc for the final solution. And the author agrees. A equals 6bc. So find the equation, variation function that varies. Let's start. Y varies jointly, which means I got a bunch of stuff going on, as x and z. Oh my gosh. So jointly with x and z, but then inversely with, so inverse means divide by w and p. I got a lot going on here. And what am I trying to find? The equation. So I don't have to solve for a letter. I don't solve for k. I just find the equation by plugging in. 60 is equal to k times the x value, 24 times 5 divided by 2 times 3. Solving for k, I'll save some number crunching time here. I think k turns out to be, you can check my math, 3, but remember that's not the final solution. Y is equal to 3xz over wp, final solution. You can check the number crunching here. It doesn't matter if you stick the 3 up top or 3 out front. I kind of like this answer a little bit better, but the author chose to write the final solution as 3 times this mess. Let's go to some word problems. The volume varies jointly, which means I got a bunch of things going on. So it varies jointly with the height and, so I'm going to say varies jointly with the height, but I've got more, and the square of the girth. And they say the girth is the distance around. So the square of the girth would be written as g squared. So what am I trying to find? What is the height? So I've got a two-stepper here again. I got to write the equation, and then part B says, go find for me the height. So the first part is, let's go for the equation by plugging in what I know. And it says the volume is who? 216. And the height is 30. And the girth is 1.5. So I'm going to plug in everything that I know. 216 is equal to k times 30 times 1.5 squared. K will turn out to be 3.2. You can pull out your calculator. But the equation would be V is equal to 3.2 hg squared. Then I'm going to try to answer the question by saying, what is the height of the tree whose volume is, so this is some new plugging in that I have to do. And so now I'll get some different colors here. Let's see, this is now 1700. And we're finding h when the girth is 2.5. So again, a two-step process. I'll plug in everything that I know. 1700 is equal to 3.2. Solve for h when the girth is 2.5. And h will turn out to be 85. Check my math. Here's how the author chose. Again, solve for 3.2, write the equation. So here's the equation, that's step A. And then after step B, answer the question, which is find the height. All right, the last example, you may think that you've seen something like this before. It looks simple. If it takes 6 hours for 25 people, how long will it take how many hours will it take 35 people? So don't write this down because this is actually wrong, and I want to show you why this is wrong. If you were to do this cross multiplying, this diagonal right here in red would give you 25x, and then equals 6 times 35, 210, and then x equaling 8.4 hours doesn't really make sense to me because this is more time, and I would guess if it takes 6 hours for 25 people, if you have more people, wouldn't it make sense for the time to be decreasing? So we've actually worked the problem incorrectly here. We've actually worked it as a variation function when really it should have been an inverse, a varies inverse. So be careful here. The amount of time should equal some constant divided by the number of people that are working on the project. So it should be an inverse variation function, where I think over here we worked it in incorrectly as a direct variation function. So I would read through this and think about the time varies inversely with the number of people. As there's more people working, it should be decreasing the amount of time, and that's not a direct variation function, that's an inverse variation function. So let's plug in our first bit of information and see if we can't get the equation. So if 6 is equal to k over 25, then k should equal 150, and the equation then should be t is equal to, well, I now know k, 150 divided by n. We could just generalize it, n, because it's not always 25, it's just always the number of people. So there's the general form of the equation, and once I have the general form of the equation, now I can find out how long it's going to take for 35 people. So the time would equal 150 divided by 35, which is now 4.3 hours, which makes a little bit more sense to me because that's less time, and this scenario does not make sense because I did a more time or direct variation function. Here's how the author, you can pause the video and read through how the author chose to solve this, but I think they're going to write the same equation. They're going to get the same value for k, and good, they got 4.3 hours as well. Then they go through a check, and then after checking they state the final solution. So I hope you found this video helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. Thanks.